Something just shifted in the Middle East, and most people still don't understand what actually happened. Iran didn't just fire missiles at Israel, it crossed a threshold that the entire post-World War II security architecture was specifically designed to prevent. At least 9 people are dead, cities are shaken, and the damage stretching across Israeli territory is not a warning shot. It is a declared reality. For decades, Iran and Israel fought each other through proxies, through shadows, through deniability. That era is now over. What you are watching unfold is a direct state-on-state military exchange between two nuclear-adjacent powers, inside the world's most geopolitically pressurized region. At a moment when Washington is distracted, NATO is stretched, and the global rules-based order is already fracturing at every seam. The people who told you this was containable were wrong. The escalation ladder has been climbed, and nobody in the room has a clear plan to come back down. Let me start by putting this into the proper historical frame, because without that frame, nothing you are about to hear will make complete sense. Iran and Israel have been in a state of strategic hostility for over 4 decades, since the Islamic Revolution of 1979 fundamentally reordered the political geometry of the Middle East. But for all those decades, the conflict operated according to a set of unwritten rules. Iran would arm Hezbollah in Lebanon, Israel would strike Iranian assets in Syria, proxies would fight proxies, and both sides would maintain enough distance to avoid the kind of direct confrontation that could spiral beyond anyone's control. That arrangement, fragile as it was, held together because both sides understood that direct engagement carried existential risks neither could fully calculate, and then it broke. Not gradually, not symbolically, but with ballistic missiles striking Israeli territory, buildings collapsing, people dying, and the entire region holding its breath, waiting to see what comes next. Now, to understand why Iran made this move, you have to step back even further and look at the pressure Iran has been operating under. The killing of senior Iranian military figures, the assassination of commanders tied to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the repeated Israeli strikes deep inside Syrian territory targeting Iranian logistics and weapons transfers, all of this has been accumulating. Every time Iran absorbed a strike without a direct response, it sent a message of restraint to its own population, to its regional allies, and to its enemies. That message, after enough repetitions, starts to look less like restraint and more like weakness. And for a government whose entire regional strategy is built on projecting strength through a network of resistance forces, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, the Iraqi militias, being perceived as weak is not just diplomatically costly, it is existentially dangerous. So understand this missile strike not as a sudden eruption of irrational aggression, but as a calculated decision made inside a specific strategic context. Iran had a threshold. That threshold got crossed. And when you cross the threshold of a government that has spent decades building a doctrine of strategic deterrence, the response is not optional. It is structural. It is baked into the logic of how that government maintains credibility with its own people, its own military, and the broader network of aligned forces it depends on for regional influence. What we saw was not Iran losing control. What we saw was Iran executing a decision it had been preparing for. Now let us talk about the missiles themselves, because this is where the story gets technically and strategically significant. Iran has spent the last 20 years investing in its ballistic missile program with extraordinary discipline and focus, largely because it understood early on that it could not compete with Israel or the United States in the air. It could not build a 5th-generation fighter fleet. It could not project air power the way Western militaries can. So instead, it built a missile force that is now among the most diverse and capable in the world outside of the major nuclear powers. Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, hypersonic glide vehicles, precision-guided munitions transferred to proxies across the region. This is Iran's air force. This is Iran's power projection capability. And what we just witnessed is what it looks like when that capability gets used at scale against a high-value adversary. The question that matters now is not whether the strikes happened. They happened. The question is what the damage tells us about the actual capability gap between what Israel's air defense systems can intercept and what Iran can actually throw at those systems. Iron Dome is impressive, Arrow is impressive, David's Sling is impressive, but no layered air defense system is a perfect shield. And when you saturate that system with enough simultaneous projectiles, ballistic missiles coming in on steep trajectories, cruise missiles flying low and slow, drones providing targeting confusion, you will find the gaps. And those gaps produce the 9 confirmed dead and the structural damage we are now seeing reported from multiple locations inside Israeli territory. That is not a small detail. That is a strategic data point that every military planner in the world is now processing. And here is the part that most of the mainstream coverage will miss entirely. Those 9 deaths and that material damage did something that decades of proxy conflict never quite managed to do. They forced Israel into a corner where inaction is politically impossible. In a country that has built its entire national security doctrine on the principle that attacks on Israeli soil will be met with overwhelming and immediate response, the government cannot simply absorb this strike and move on. The domestic political pressure alone makes that impossible, but the response options are all complicated. A proportional response risks another Iranian escalation. A disproportionate response risks drawing in Hezbollah on a second front, possibly triggering full-scale conflict on the Lebanese border at exactly the moment Israeli forces are already stretched. And any response that strikes Iranian territory directly risks pulling in the wider regional dynamic in ways that could cascade in directions nobody can fully predict. This is the trap that has been constructed here, whether by design or by the accumulated logic of years of escalating pressure. Israel is not in a position to do nothing. Iran is not in a position to back down without losing face. And the United States, which theoretically has the leverage and the relationships to manage de-escalation, is operating in a political environment where the domestic constraints on American foreign policy have never been more complex or more paralyzing. Washington has interests in this. Washington has commitments to Israel that are not merely political but are woven into congressional legislation, into military aid agreements, into intelligence sharing frameworks that go back generations. But Washington also has an interest in not being dragged into a regional war with a country that has missiles that can reach American bases across the Middle East. Let us talk about those American bases for a moment, because they are a critical piece of this puzzle that gets overlooked in the immediate drama of the Israeli casualty count and the footage of damaged buildings. The United States has forward deployed military assets across the region, in Qatar, in Bahrain, in Kuwait, in the UAE, in Jordan, in Iraq. Those assets have been within range of Iranian missiles for years. Iran has demonstrated on multiple occasions, including the January 2020 strikes on Al-Assad airbase following the killing of Qasem Soleimani, that it is willing and capable of using those missiles against American military infrastructure. The message that was sent in 2020 was deliberately calibrated to avoid American casualties. The question now is whether Iran maintains that calibration in a situation that is considerably more heated than 2020, and where the pressure on Iranian leadership to demonstrate resolve is considerably more intense. And then you have to factor in the global economic dimension, because that is where this conflict stops being a regional story and becomes a story that affects every American household. Oil, the Strait of Hormuz. About 20% of the world's daily oil supply passes through that narrow waterway. Iran has the capability to threaten, disrupt, or close that strait. It has done so rhetorically for years. It has conducted exercises in that waterway. It has seized tankers. It has used Houthi forces in Yemen to attack shipping in the Red Sea. All of this represents a graduated escalation strategy that has been in play for well over a year. If this conflict expands further, and there are real reasons to think it might, the risk to global energy infrastructure is not hypothetical. It is concrete, it is documented, and it is something that commodity markets are already beginning to price in. Here is the broader picture that I want you to hold in your mind as you process everything else you are hearing about this. We are living through a period of genuinely historic geopolitical restructuring. The unipolar moment, the period after the Cold War, where American primacy was so overwhelming that it structured every major global dynamic, is ending. Not collapsing suddenly, not disappearing overnight, but receding. And as it recedes, the spaces it leaves behind are being filled by regional powers asserting their own interests with their own logic and their own tools. Iran is one of those regional powers, China is another, Russia is another, and the rules that governed their behavior during the era of American dominance were, in a very real sense, enforced by that dominance. As the dominance weakens, the rules weaken with it. What you are watching in the Middle East right now is not just a conflict between Iran and Israel. It is a live test of whether the existing structures of deterrence and alliance still function in a world where American power is more constrained than it has been at any point in the last 3 decades. And the result of that test matters enormously, not just for the people of Israel and Iran who are living through it right now, but for every other flashpoint on the global map. Taiwan is watching, Ukraine is watching, North Korea is watching. Every government that has structured its security calculations around the assumption of American protection or American deterrent power is watching to see how this plays out. Now, I want to address something that will get lost in the immediate noise of the news cycle, but is absolutely essential to understanding the deeper stakes here. Iran did not make this decision alone. It made it inside a regional and global context where it has spent years carefully building relationships with Russia and China, both of whom have an interest in seeing American power and Israeli strategic dominance tested and complicated. That does not mean Moscow or Beijing pulled the trigger. It means that Iran has calculated, correctly or incorrectly, that its strategic isolation is less severe than it was a decade ago, that Russia and China provide enough diplomatic cover, enough economic support under sanctions, enough strategic ambiguity to make a direct military action more survivable politically and economically than it would have been in 2005 or 2010. That calculation may prove to be correct, it may prove to be badly wrong, but it is the calculation that was made. Think about what Russia gets from a Middle East in flames. Russian oil revenues go up when energy prices spike. American attention and military resources get pulled toward the Gulf and away from Ukraine. The narrative that the United States is an unreliable, destabilizing actor in global affairs gets reinforced. None of this requires a conspiracy. All of it follows from basic strategic logic. And when you apply that logic, you start to understand why the current crisis is not happening in isolation. It is happening at the intersection of multiple competing strategic projects that have been building for years. For ordinary Americans watching this unfold on their phones and television screens, the temptation is to see this as a distant conflict between foreign governments in a complicated region. And there is a psychological comfort in that framing. But it does not survive contact with the actual facts. American soldiers are stationed throughout the region. American diplomatic credibility is directly tied to what happens next. American energy prices will be affected by what happens to Gulf shipping. American allies in Europe, already rattled by the Ukraine conflict, are watching to see whether the alliance architecture they depend on still functions under real pressure. The consequences of this escalation do not stay in the Middle East, they travel. And here is the thing about consequences that travel. They tend to arrive before the institutions designed to manage them have time to adapt. The United Nations Security Council will convene. Statements will be issued. Emergency diplomatic channels will be activated. All of this will happen with great seriousness and great ceremony. And it will matter very little because the structural forces driving this conflict are not responding to UN resolutions or emergency diplomatic cables. They are responding to the internal logic of governments under pressure, to the calculations of military planners who have been preparing contingencies for years, and to the momentum of events that have already been set in motion. What matters now, what you should actually be watching, is the sequence of Israeli decision-making over the next 72 hours. That decision-making will tell you whether this crisis is going to find a temporary plateau or whether it is going to accelerate into something that reorganizes the regional balance in ways that will take years to fully understand. Watch where Israel strikes, if it strikes. Watch the scale. Watch whether Hezbollah opens a second front. Watch what happens to oil prices. Watch whether American carrier groups change their positioning. Those are the real-time indicators. Those are the signals inside the noise. Because here is the honest truth about moments like this one. We do not know yet how it ends. Nobody does. What we can know, what careful analysis of history, of strategic logic, of the actual documented behavior of the governments involved actually tells us, is that the conditions for prolonged escalation are all present, the mechanisms for de-escalation are all weakened, and the world that exists on the other side of this crisis will not be identical to the world that existed before the first missile was fired. Something has changed, the threshold has been crossed, and in geopolitics, crossed thresholds very rarely uncross themselves.